Hi guys, welcome to our daily encounter. In Exodus chapter 17, we have a time in which Amalek comes up against the children of Israel. And Moses takes the staff of God up on a hill, and as long as Moses holds his hands up, then the children of Israel have success over Amalek. But as soon as he lowers his hand, then Amalek begins to win. And you can imagine how tired Moses' hands would become, how tired his arms would become, the longer that he tried to hold them up. And so they give him a stone to sit on, and then Aaron and come up beside him and hold up his arms, and help him hold up his hands so that the children of Israel can win. And ultimately, that's what happens. The children of Israel have victory over their enemies. And as we think about this in terms of our own battles that we face on a day-to-day basis, we can see that some of the things that Moses did here can symbolize what we can do as we come up against our spiritual enemies. If you remember, in Ephesians chapter 6, we're told that we don't really wrestle against flesh and blood. In that particular story, they were wrestling against flesh and blood, against Amalek. But spiritually speaking, our battles are actually go a lot deeper than that. In Ephesians chapter 6 and verse 12, it says, "For our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the powers, against the world forces of this darkness, against the spiritual forces of wickedness in the heavenly places." So we too have battles. And sometimes it might appear in physical form, but Paul would say ultimately these things have spiritual forces behind them that we're really battling against. But these things that Moses does are things that we can put into place, spiritually speaking. For one, he had the staff of God close by. He was near to the staff of God. And when we think about the staff of God as symbolizing the cross, I think this gives great significance to this story. As a matter of fact, many of the stories found in Moses's in the Exodus and Moses leading the people into the land of promise, when you think about the staff of God as the cross, oftentimes that will bring a deeper meaning to the various stories that you come across. And we see that here as well. Here, the staff of God can symbolize the cross. That is, if we want to have victory over our enemies, first we have to be near the cross. We've got to have the cross. We have to come to God through faith in the accomplished work of Christ on the cross. That's the starting point. Without the cross, any battles we might try to wage against our enemies will be fruitless and will not be successful. So the first thing we must have in our lives is the cross. We must always be walking under the shadow of the cross. But the other thing we have here is that Moses lifted up his hands. And the text, although he has his staff with him, the text doesn't mention him lifting the staff. It has him lifting his hands. A careful reading will show that to be the case. Now, it's assumed that he's lifting the staff because he has the staff in his hand when he goes up on the hill, but it doesn't specifically mention it. So there might be something else being symbolized here, and that is of prayer. The lifting up of hands symbolizes prayer. In 1 Timothy chapter 2 and verse 8, Paul told Timothy, he said, "Therefore I want the men in every place to pray, lifting up holy hands without wrath and dissension." The lifting up of hands would symbolize prayer. And so that's the other thing that we need when it comes to battling against our spiritual enemies. As a matter of fact, going back to Ephesians chapter 6, after he talks about taking up the full armor of God, and he lists out all the various components of that armor, he summarizes by saying in verse 18, "With all prayer and petition, pray at all times in the Spirit." So there he connects this battle, this wrestling against these spiritual forces, and this putting on the armor of God. He talks about it in terms of prayer and praying in the Spirit. And so prayer is very important. So if we are going to overcome our enemies, we must be constant in prayer, praying at all times, praying in the Spirit, walking according to the Spirit, keeping our mind on spiritual things through prayer, keeping our hearts lifted up to the Lord, fixing our eyes on the Lord through prayer, worshiping the Lord in prayer, just constantly keeping our minds and hearts fixed on Him. And so long as we do that, we have victory over our enemies. It's when we get tired, when we begin to lower our hands, when we cease praying, when we cease fixing our eyes on the Lord and focusing on the Lord, that's when we become vulnerable to the enemy's attacks. And that's when we have to lift up our hands again, and we have to turn back to the Lord and get back into prayer and pray without ceasing, praying at all times in the Spirit to begin to have victory again. Prayer is a key component and a key element of our fighting against and having success against our enemies. But he was also sitting on a stone. And we're told in 1 Peter chapter 2 that Christ is a stone, and we are all living stones being built up in connection to him. And so the idea here could be symbolizing our resting in Christ. We sit on the stone too. In other words, we might get tired battling it out with the spiritual enemies that are coming up against us, where we may be laboring in prayer, becoming exhausted. We need to remember that, you know what? I need to rest in Christ, to sit on the stone, to rest on the rock of my salvation, to remember who it is who holds me up, who props me up, and it's none other than Jesus Christ himself. And when we are able to, yes, still stay engaged in prayer, but at the same time be resting in Christ, we begin to have more victory over our enemies, over our spiritual enemies. So far, everything that we looked at are things that we can do individually. Individually, we can go to the cross and operate under the shadow of the cross. That's our beginning point of having victory over our enemies. We can lift up our hands, so to speak, in prayer and focusing and centering our heart on the Lord. And we can rest on Christ, resting on the rock of our salvation. And these are all things that we can do individually to help us gain the victory. But let's not forget that we also need others to come alongside of us. And that's where Aaron and Hur come in this story. Even though Moses had the rock to sit on, even though, he was lifting up his hands to the Lord, and he knew that victory came from lifting up his hands, he still needed people to physically come alongside of him and hold him up, hold up his hands. And we need that as well. That's where the church becomes very important. Being plugged into a community of believers who can help us when we become weary, when we become tired, when the battles become fierce and we begin to wear down. That's where going to church, being around other believers, and it doesn't always have to be in an official assembly, although you would definitely want to have that as well. But it could be also just having relationships with other Christians and being able to share life with other brothers and sisters in Christ, and being able to lift each other up and hold each other up day in and day out. In Hebrews, we're told to encourage each other while it is still called today. And we all need encouragement each and every day. And so hopefully we can have people who will come alongside of us to help us, to strengthen us, and to help us to be able to hold up our hands, to keep staying fixed on the Lord, and to continue to win the battle. So these are some things we can practically do to help us in this battle against these spiritual forces that come up against us. It might seem overwhelming. I'm sure this army of Amalek seemed very overwhelming. But if we can just put these things into practice, stay near to the cross, stay constant in prayer, rest in Christ, but at the same time have people who can come alongside of us to encourage us and strengthen us, we can have the victory. And we can have the victory over the enemy and draw all the more closer to the Lord and enjoy a relationship with him. So these are some things we can think about and reflect on as we do our reading today. With that, guys, I do thank you for watching the video today. Hope you guys have a great day. Love you guys. God bless.